Well, even just a precursory look or precursory experience with modern surfing shows you that, you know, it hasn't been the weather, it hasn't been the waves, it hasn't been bathymetry, it hasn't been geography, it hasn't been technology, it hasn't been technique, it hasn't been personalities or performance. Nothing has affected the aesthetics of the surfing culture more than the media. And the reason for this, I think, is very simple. Every single wave that breaks is definitively unique. Actually, a wave is one of the only truly unique things that you'll ever encounter, meaning that there is only one. Every single wave is unique. Every single wave only breaks once. And as simply a band of energy moving through a liquid medium, that wave only becomes visible for a moment, and then it's gone, and it's absorbed back into the whole. So when you think about that, everything in a surfer's life, that moment that surfers live for, the moment that some of them, and some of us, have based our whole lives around, is the most ephemeral of moments. It only exists like a dream almost, and then it's gone. And so, over the decades, and actually centuries, the only way that we can truly examine our sport and examine and consider what we do and consider who we are is to depict it. That's the only way we can do it. And people have sought to depict it for many, many years. And as an example of that, this is a first edition published in 1833 of Polynesian Researches by William Ellis. And it was published 186 years ago. And in this book, which I'm really happy to share with all of you afterwards, is the very first picture, the very first depiction of surfing in history. I love this. When you think about, this was an attempt to capture and show and share with the world what surfing was. The early visitors to Hawaii, some of them were repelled by surfing, and you know, I would assume it was basically, that was because of the nudity involved, but a lot of them were fascinated with the sport. They were fascinated with this passion of this Polynesian pastime. And so this is the very first depiction ever. And what I love to think about is this book is that, for the most part, the only way that this book was viewed was by firelight in the evening. Because back then, most people were, you know, reading it probably by candlelight in the evening. But that was 186 years ago. And so, over those 186 years, the original depiction of surfing, has led to, basically, me. I'm sort of the, you know, distal end of this effort. I've been working in the surf media, the modern surf media, for over 3 decades now. And over those 3 decades, or actually over, I would say, the modern surf media, over the 53 years that we've had what I call the modern surf media, which was the beginning of the first periodicals about surfing. Over those 53 years, the media has in many ways done what this book did. It has enthralled people. It has shared surfing with the rest of the world. It's inspired people. It's sort of brought that magic that surfers feel, and it's shared it with around the world. But during those same 53 years, along with the inspiration and along with the excitement, along with the articulation, there's also been a subversive, dark, sort of sub-level influence that the media has had on surf culture. And that sort of subversive movement, if you will, I call the myth of perfection. And that's what I'm going to be talking a little bit about right now. It wasn't always that way. When you look back at the culture that this book described, the original Hawaiian surf culture had everything. It had everything that we have today. I mean, there were heiaus that were dedicated to surfing, where people would go and you know, in many cases, they would pray for the surf to come up, or they would just, you know, the heiaus were dedicated to surfing. They had actual surf forecasting. They had kahunas that were the Sean Collins of their day that learned to read the conditions and learned to read the elements, and they could actually predict the surf. And not only predict it, but there was actually heiaus on Diamond Head that when the surf came up, they would fly kites so that the inlanders, you know, in Manoa Valley or Honolulu could see, hey, the surf's up, let's go surfing. They had shapers that were capable of very sophisticated hydrodynamic surf designs, and I'm sure, you know, we're going to learn a lot about that from Mr. Stone. They had surf competitions, they had surf exploration, they even had localism, which back then was based on royal lineage. But the one thing that they didn't have was bigotry. Because back then, everybody surfed. And I'm going to read a passage here that describes that. It describes what that early surf culture. Well, I got my old man glasses on. The print was a lot smaller back then. I don't know what that was all about. But this is a wonderful chapter called Swimming in the Surf, is how he described it. It gives a wonderful description, the missionary William Ellis, about how surfboards were made and how the love and the thought and the care they put into their surfboards. But the part that I like is that he says, sometimes the greater part of the inhabitants of a village go out to this sport when the wind blows fresh towards the shore and spend the greater part of the day in the water. All ranks and ages appear equally fond of it. We have seen kahunas and chiefs, some of them the highest in the island, aged both between 50 and 60 years of age, and large corpulent men balancing themselves on their narrow board or splashing about in the foam with as much satisfaction as youths of 16. There's just something about that back then, everybody surfed. And everybody surfed everything back then. They rode olos, they rode alayas, they rode paipos, they body surfed, they canoe surfed, they rode everything. There was no distinction. It was about riding waves. It wasn't about what you rode or how you rode them. And that aesthetic actually survived into the 20th century. It survived in the sort of genre that now we call the waterman. If you look back at some of the early images of surfing in the 20th century, and well into the 20th century, you saw, it just looked different. You saw people riding all different types of surfboards, and you saw people riding together, and you saw, you know, you look back at those old pictures, and you always think, God, look at those guys, they're all dropping in on each other. Well, they didn't look at it that way. They were riding together, you know, and they rode lots of different types of surfboards, and the sort of intrepid women that surfed with them, they were welcomed. You know, nowadays the term waterman generally is used to describe someone that rides big waves, but back then, the waterman ethic sort of was the carrying on of that early Polynesian aesthetic of the fact that everybody surfed. But with the birth of the modern surf media, which I am saying begins, I mean, Bud Brown made the first surf movie in 1953. If you go back and look at that movie today, Hawaiian, I think it's called Hawaiian Surf, I mean, it looks, everything in it looks fun. Everything in it looks frivolous. With the birth of the modern surf media, which I say started in 1960 with the publishing of the very first issue of Surfer magazine, the surfing aesthetic, it took a bit of a dark turn, and this is why I think that's so. When you go back and look at that very first issue of Surfer published by John Severson, most of it was outtakes from his movie, Surf Fever, that he was going to put out that year. If you look at the bulk of that magazine, you see guys like 3 at a time surfing and shooting the Huntington Beach Pier. You see, you know, 16-year-old Linda Benson, you know, surfing through the Makaha shorebreak. You see Mickey Munoz doing things called the El Telefono and the Quasimodo, just goofing around, you know, at Seiko's, having a great time. But at the last page of the very first issue of Surfer, the ordinarily generous John Severson ran a photo of a lone surfer paddling out on a real clean little day at Hammond's Reef. And he wrote, perhaps innocently so, what I think were the most corrosive lines ever written about the surfing culture. And he wrote, in today's crowded world, the surfer can still seek and find the perfect day, the perfect wave, and be alone with the surf and his thoughts. So what did that introduce? That powerful coda at the end of this frivolous, fun magazine that showed all these guys out there having a great time. You know, there's one shot where there's 8 guys dropping in on a wave at Waimea Bay in that magazine. But at the end, those 2 concepts that he sort of almost inadvertently introduced. One, the concept of the perfect or ideal wave. And number 2, the concept that to experience that ideal, it had to be experienced alone. And I think those 2 elements led to what I call in surfing the myth of perfection. Because suddenly, it wasn't that everybody surfed. It was that you surfed. And when you mix that with that ideal of the perfect wave, which in many cases, you know, is impossible to achieve, and then you mix that with the actual concept that to experience that, you had to surf it alone, it's only natural that that would breed a resentment and a frustration. And I think that's that sort of frustration that has led to almost all the ills of surfing. I mean, what Trey was talking about just a few minutes ago, you know, that it's that frustration of not achieving the ideal in surfing. And you know, you can see this, that sort of ideal has been fostered over these last 50 years in the surf media. I've been responsible. I've been working in the surf media for over 30 years. You know, I've been responsible for fostering that myself. And when you look at, even today, when you look at the, you know, you look at the media, you can see the effects of both of those concepts. I mean, for example, in Indonesia's, the remotest islands of Indonesia, you go to these remote villages where surfers, think about this, surfers were the first white men, the first foreigners that many of these villagers ever saw. You go to those villages today, and on a particularly good day of waves, the kids describe the waves as like magazine. Like when you ask them, how is the surf? They go, like magazine. Okay? These are the waves that have been breaking in front of their villages for time immemorial. They've grown up looking at those waves. But suddenly now, because of the depiction of it, a good day of waves is like magazine. You know, you look at websites, you know, and I'm going to say really fantastic websites like Surfline, and you will be hearing from the editorial director later in a few minutes. And yet, it's almost like there's a pervasive aspect of it even in their coverage of the surf, which in many cases, they run features where they show fantastic surf, great spots, exotic new waves, beautiful, perfect waves, but we're not going to tell you where it is. Now, they can actually assert their sort of policy, and it's a good policy in its heart of saying, you know what, we want to inspire people. We want to tell people, look, it's still out there. That perfection that was defined in that first Surfer magazine and that lone perfection is still out there. We want to inspire you. We want you to get up there and go out and look for it. But there's another aspect of doing that, and what that's saying is, you know what, look what we found. And we're not going to tell you where it is, but we have it. On the other hand, you know, the magazines and the websites will print pictures of like 30-foot cloud break, 30-foot gnarly cloud break in Fiji, and they'll call it perfect. You know, that's basically like those pictures of cloud break at 30 feet that they call perfect, that's basically the Victoria's Secret catalog of surfing. I mean, A, who of any of us is ever going to achieve that? And B, who of us think that 30-foot gnarly cloud break is perfect? I mean, 1% of 1% of 1% of the surfers in the world are even capable of surfing that. But it's that pervasive ideal that there's this perfect wave out there and that you don't have it. And that even if you found it, you might not get enough of it. And that's led to this whole sort of culture of attainment to where surfers are constantly wanting to, you know, achieve that element of perfection. And the perfection, what I think is sort of based on a false ideal. I mean, I remember I got called one time by an editor of a Brazilian surf magazine, and I was the editor of Surfer at the time, and he said, Sam, we're doing this article on the 10 most perfect waves in the world, and we want your list. We want your list. And I said, well, what do you mean perfect? He goes, perfect, you know, perfect. I said, okay, number 1, Waikiki. And he goes, well, what do you mean? I go, Waikiki is the perfect place to teach someone how to surf. I said, number 2, Makaha in Hawaii, perfect place to surf tandem. I said, then I'd say Macaronis in Sumatra, perfect place to put a modern competitive shortboard through its paces. And number 4, I said Piahi on Maui, perfect place for toe-in surfing with that big channel and that perfect peak. And he goes, no, Sam, he goes, I'm talking about perfect waves. Perfect. And I said, well, perfect for what? And he goes, thank you, and he hung up on me. You know? Because when you think about it, just even the idea of a perfection or a perfect wave, it's ultimately corrosive. It's the most anti-Zen thing you could think of. Talk about not ever being able to live in the moment, which surfers like to talk about, oh, I feel alive on the wave. Well, the whole idea of a perfect wave, it's so anti-Zen, because the only Zen experience that's possible in surfing is the sincere belief that every single wave is perfect. It's that's the only way that you can achieve, you know, that mystical Zen thing. I mean, we think Zen is Rob Machado's hair and the way he bends his knee in the tube. No, Zen is the belief that every single wave you ride, every single wave is perfect. When you think about all the natural elements that combine to make the lowliest crumbling wave at Pedro Point, or Manresa, or San Onofre, or Eva Beach, you know, or Gilgo Beach. When you think about the incredible natural elements that come together to make even the lowliest little 2-foot wave, how could you not perceive that every wave is perfect, or that every wave is in fact a miracle? And the wonderful thing is that we get to ride it. But that ethic, that aesthetic, you're not going to get any help with that in the modern surf media. You know, if you really look at it, for a variety of reasons, the modern surf media over the last 50 years has taken and still presents an extremely narrow point of view, a narrow perspective of the surfing world. I used to say back when surf photographers actually used cameras with shutter speed. One time we took a whole year of magazine photos, a whole 12-month publishing cycle. And we added up all the time that all those images represented in a surfer's life. When you're thinking about, some of them are shooting at 1/500th of a second. And when we added it all up, I said, you know what? We've covered about 2 minutes of surfing in these magazines. All those little frozen moments, we've covered about 2 minutes of the surfing experience, the experience that we think is our whole lives are based on. So there's been a very narrow representation. I mean, there's been a lot of wonderful things. I mean, the photography and stories. The modern surf media has helped surfing and helped the joy of surfing spread all around the world. And it has established a lot of fine elements and fine aspects of the surfing culture. But pretty much it's been a very narrow point of view. But the wonderful thing about surfing, and ultimately about surf culture, is that regardless of the media, surfing has always sought to identify itself. And it has done so by itself. Because when you look back on it, I mean, if you looked at the modern surf magazines and even the websites, would you have any idea that the average age of a California surfer is 38 years old? 20 years ago at Clark Foam, which was the major surfboard, core blank manufacturer in the world, 20 years ago, longboard blanks far surpassed shortboard blanks. But they suppressed that information because so much of the magazine and so much of the endorsement-based marketing that fuels the media was based on a different sort of surfing. But those are sort of, when you really think about how surfing has identified itself. I mean, the shortboard era lasted only a few years. It went from like 68 to about 72, and then people started riding longboards again. So much so that they even had to put one on the cover in 1976. You know, a new longboard shot was back on the cover of Surfer in 1976. You know, and lately also, when you look at how surfing is starting to express itself, surf schools. You know, I mean, I know Santa Cruz has had a real big problem with surf schools, but surf schools have proliferated around the world, you know, bringing new people into the sport. Women's surfing has grown, you know, hugely. One of the biggest, really, when you look at it, one of the biggest trends has been women's surfing. You know, people are riding longboards, people are body surfing, people are going back and trying like alayas and wooden finless boards and, you know, this whole retro surfboard thing. It's not just a fashion, it's that surfers are seeking something else than they generally see in the magazines and the movies. And even the latest form, really the latest form, a new form of surfing. Think about this, a new form of surfing has popped up in the last 10 years, stand-up paddling. A whole new form of surfing. All of this is happening independently of the main trends of the surfing media. And I think that that's a wonderful thing. I mean, I made the contention, a rather provocative contention, that we've been living, really, if you look at the history of surfing from ancient Polynesia all the way through the early 20th century, up until 1960, and then to right now, I think that if you look at it that way, you can only believe that we have been living in a dark ages. We've been living in the dark ages of surfing because what else could explain a surfer that would punch another surfer just because he's from a different beach? Or to tell a young surfer that pulls up to a spot, no, you can't surf here. Or what would make a surfer key another surfer's car? Or hate another, say he hates another surfer just because of the choice of equipment they rode. Do you think any ancient Hawaiian bad vibed another one because he was riding a paipo and not an alaya? I don't think so. But I think that all of this, everything, all these trends that are happening in the sport, the trends that aren't really represented in the modern media, I think that shows that surfing is emerging from a dark ages. I was giving a talk to a surf school a while back, and I was out looking out over the people. You know, these surfers. Now, I grew up during a time when surfing was monochromatic. I mean, we all looked the same. We all rode the same boards. Our hair was the same. We wore the same cargo pocket shorts and Oaxacan Mexican tops. We all looked the same. I looked out at this crowd. There were kids. There were teens. There were girls. There were dads and moms that were taking this surf school with their kids. There were middle-aged people. And I looked out to them and I said, hey, I want to ask you something. How many of you think you know the definition of the term radical? And if, a couple kids raised their hand, of course, and they were saying, heirs and, mute heirs, slob heirs, And I said, well, think about this. One of the really definitions of radical, it means a return to the origin, which is why a 360 is basically the most radical turn you can do, because you go all the way back to the origin. I said, when you think that the origins of surfing, that surfing was a sport where everybody surfed, and everybody surfed, and everybody surfed everything, and even if you were a royal that got to surf Queens, or if you were just a commoner that had to go to Publix, you were all in it together. I said, if you think about that, and you think about that as being the origins of surfing, you guys here today, beginning surfing for the first time, you're the most radical surfers on earth. Because you are returning, you're coming back to an origin. And I think that's a really healthy thing. And like I said, I've been in the media now, working in a lot of different capacities. As an editor and a writer, I've written ad copy. I mean, I really have been a big part of the problem for many of those years of perpetuating this myth of perfection. I dedicated my life to this ideal that I had to achieve a certain thing to be valid as a surfer. So in a way, this is an indictment of myself and my career path, but I think that the wonderful thing is we're emerging from that period, and I'm hoping that as we do, all the various surf medias sort of evolve along with the sport, because the sport is evolving. The sport is trying to identify itself. It's trying to describe to itself who we are. The problem is, in so many cases, the resistance comes from within. No, longboarders, they don't like longboarders. Bodyboarders, no, don't like bodyboarders. Kneeboarders, stand-up guys, girls, old guys, That's surfing. Like it or not, that's surfing. That's surfing identifying itself. And I think that if the media evolves along with the sport, we could be taking all this new aesthetic of surfing, which is actually the old aesthetic of surfing, and bring it forward into the years to come. And as an example of that, I'm going to read another passage. I never found, actually, I actually saw in New York City at Bauman's Books, I saw a first edition of The 3 Voyages of Captain James Cook Around the World, which is an amazing thing because it may not have included the first depiction of surfing, but this book had the very first description of surfing by a foreigner. My volume here is only from 1821, so it's relatively new compared to the first edition that came out in 1779. But it's kind of interesting because Trey actually quoted from this book, and it's one of the most famous quotes about surfing ever written. And to tell you the truth, I mean, I've been writing about surfing, I've been blabbing about surfing, you know, my entire adult life. It could be that over those 30 years, I've written more words about surfing than anyone else. Nothing I've written comes close to the very first description of surfing. But if you look at it in a different light, you'll see how sort of evocative and how forward-thinking this is. Because in this, he wrote, "Of this I met with a remarkable instance. For on walking one day around Matavai Point, where our tents are erected, I saw a man paddling, quickly, looking about him with such eagerness on each side as to command my attention. At first I imagined he had stolen something from one of our ships. How's that? Already the establishment was looking at a surfer and thinking there was something wrong with him. But first I thought he'd stolen something from one of the ships and was pursued, but on waiting patiently saw him repeat his amusement. He went out from shore till he was near the place where the swell begins to take its rise, and watching its first motion very attentively, paddled before it with great quickness, till he found that it overtook him, and acquired sufficient force to carry him before it without passing underneath. He then was carried along at the same swift rate as the wave until it landed on the beach. Then he started out and went in search of another swell. I could not help concluding that this man felt the most supreme pleasure while he was driven on so fast and so smoothly by the sea." That very first description of surfing, that surfer, the progenitor of all of us, who felt that most supreme pleasure, was surfing in a canoe on a 2-foot wave. And that, to me, is the best message that we at the media can take from this, the original surf media, is that most supreme pleasure, it doesn't have to happen at 30-foot cloud break. It doesn't have to happen at some distant beach, some distant point where somehow you've attained this ideal and you're surfing it all alone. You're experiencing it alone. The supreme pleasure is available. The supreme pleasure is achievable. It's attainable by all of us, every day, on any wave, at any spot. And that to me is sort of the challenge of the media in the years to come, is to foster that aesthetic, which I sum up in one simple statement: we're all in it together. Thank you.